People like to believe that when something terrible happens, there is always a moment beforehand, a sound, a warning, a decision that feels obviously wrong in hindsight. But some disasters arrive quietly, without drama, without permission, and without leaving behind a clear reason for why they happened at all. The Dyatlov Pass Incident is one of those stories. Not because it is loud or violent, but because it is restrained. Because it happened to people who did everything right. And because even now, more than 60 years later, it refuses to explain itself. In the winter of 1959, 9 experienced hikers walked into the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. They were young, confident, disciplined, and trained for exactly the conditions they would face. They were not lost. They were not reckless. They were not unprepared. And yet, every one of them would die on a single mountain slope, leaving behind a mystery so complete that even modern investigators still argue about what truly happened that night. To understand why this story is so unsettling, you have to begin before the mountain, before the snow, before the night itself. You have to begin with who these people were, when they still believed they would return home. They were students at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in the city of Sverdlovsk. Engineers, builders, physicists. Practical thinkers, trained to trust logic over superstition. Winter expeditions were not unusual for them. They skied through frozen terrain for pleasure and for challenge. Cold was not something they feared. It was something they respected, something they prepared for carefully. The group was led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. Young, but trusted. Calm under pressure, methodical by nature. The kind of person who did not panic easily and did not cut corners. When Dyatlov planned an expedition, he checked routes again and again, measured distances, reviewed equipment lists, until nothing felt uncertain. The others trusted him without hesitation. There were 10 hikers at the start. 10 friends laughing together as they posed for photographs before leaving the city. Heavy packs on their backs, skis resting against their shoulders, faces relaxed, confident. None of them believed this journey would be anything other than difficult, exhausting, and ultimately successful. One of them, a young man named Yuri Yudin, would never reach the mountain. Early in the journey, pain crept into his body. At first, it was easy to ignore. Pain was expected on expeditions like this. But the discomfort grew worse. His joints ached, his strength faded. He realized that continuing would slow the group and put everyone at risk. The decision to turn back was made quietly, reluctantly, without ceremony. Yuri wanted to continue. He wanted to finish what they had started together. Instead, he watched the others disappear into the snowy distance. Later, he would say that the goodbye felt ordinary. That nothing about it felt final. As the remaining 9 continued forward, civilization slowly dissolved behind them. Roads narrowed, then vanished. Villages became fewer and farther apart. Trees grew denser. Snow thickened. Sound softened until even voices felt muted, as though the landscape itself were listening. Days settled into a rhythm. Skiing. Adjusting packs. Checking maps. Melting snow for water. Nights were spent inside tents, bodies pressed close together for warmth, breath fogging the fabric walls. They documented everything. They kept personal diaries. They maintained a group journal. They took photographs along the way. These records would later become some of the most disturbing elements of the case, not because they hinted at danger, but because they didn't. The diary entries are ordinary. Complaints about sore muscles. Jokes about food. Casual observations about the weather. There is no fear in those pages. No sense of unease. Nothing that suggests they believed they were in danger. On January 31st, the group reached the slope of a mountain known to the local Montsi people as Kolat-Sayakol. The name translates to Mountain of the Dead. The hikers knew the name. Someone even joked about it. To them, it was just a translation, a curiosity. They did not believe mountains carried intention or memory. That afternoon, the weather began to change. The wind grew sharper, pulling heat from exposed skin. Snow fell thicker, flattening the landscape into white and gray. Visibility narrowed. The horizon disappeared. Below them was a forested area that could provide shelter from the wind. Trees could block gusts. Snowdrifts could be shaped into protection. Descending would cost time and energy, but it would offer safety. Instead, they chose to camp on the open slope. This decision would later be debated endlessly. But it is important to understand, it was not reckless. Experienced hikers sometimes camped on slopes to avoid unnecessary descent and ascent. They cut into the snow, anchored the tent, reinforced it carefully against the wind. Everything about their actions suggested confidence, not fear. Inside the tent that night, they prepared for sleep the way they always did. Boots were removed. Heavy outer clothing was loosened. Bodies were arranged close together to share warmth. This detail matters. People do not undress when they expect danger. They do not make themselves vulnerable unless they feel safe. Nothing about that moment suggests panic. And then, something happened. We do not know what woke them. There were no survivors to explain it. But we know how they reacted. Instead of unzipping the tent entrance, they cut through the fabric from the inside. Multiple slashes. Uneven. Desperate. This was not a single person panicking alone. It was a shared response. A collective urgency. A moment when all 9 reached the same conclusion at once. Whatever was happening, they could not remain inside the tent. They fled. They did not stop to gather boots or coats. They did not pack supplies. They ran into darkness, into wind, into temperatures approaching minus 30 degrees Celsius. In those conditions, exposed skin freezes within minutes. Judgment fails quickly. Survival depends on shelter. And yet, they moved away from it. Later, when searchers found the footprints, they were disturbed by what they saw. The trail showed no chaos. No signs of pursuit. Some footprints were barefoot. Others were in socks. One showed a single shoe. The group moved downhill together, toward the forest. Not scattering. Not running wildly. Whatever drove them out did not follow them. And that detail would trouble investigators for decades. The forest did not announce itself dramatically. It did not open suddenly. It did not offer safety in any obvious way. It simply rose up out of the slope, dark shapes against darker snow, branches heavy, trunk still, waiting. This was where the footprints led. This was where the hikers had gone, after leaving the tent behind. And this was where the first signs of what had truly happened began to appear. When the search teams reached the edge of the trees weeks later, they expected chaos. They expected broken equipment, scattered belongings, signs of struggle. Instead, they found silence. The snow lay undisturbed, except where the hikers had passed. No track marks. No deep disturbances. Just the soft record of people moving, step by step, into a place that offered no warmth and no answers. Beneath a tall cedar tree, 2 bodies lay side by side. They were young men, barely clothed. Their skin was darkened by cold, their limbs rigid, their faces frozen into expressions that were difficult to read. Not panic. Not peace. Something in between. Their clothing was not torn, not ripped away. It was simply missing. This detail troubled investigators deeply. In winter, clothing is life. You do not remove it unless judgment has already begun to fail. Their hands told a story the rest of their bodies could not. Fingers scraped raw. Skin broken. Nails damaged. The marks suggested effort, desperation. Investigators believed they had climbed the cedar tree. Branches above were broken. Bark was disturbed. But no one could explain why. Perhaps they wanted to see something beyond the darkness. Perhaps they were trying to escape something on the ground. Or perhaps climbing simply felt instinctive, a movement upward, when there was nowhere else to go. Nearby, searchers found the remains of a small fire. Charred wood. Ash pressed into the snow. It was fragile, brief, uncertain. An attempt to bring warmth back into a world that had already turned against them. In temperatures like these, fire does not last long. Wind steals heat. Snow absorbs flame. Cold always wins. But the attempt mattered. It meant they were thinking. It meant they believed survival was still possible. Between the cedar tree and the tent, 3 more bodies lay scattered across the slope. They were not resting. They were moving. One lay face down, arms stretched forward, as though pulling himself across the snow. Another lay curled on his side, posture tight, defensive. The third was positioned higher up the slope, closer to the tent, angled toward it, as if he had been trying to return. These positions were not random. They told a story of intention, of realization, of decision. At some point, these hikers understood what the cold would do to them. They tried to go back. They did not make it. All 5 of these hikers were determined to have died from hypothermia. Their injuries were minor. Scratches. Bruises. The kinds of marks that come from moving through rough terrain, in the dark. At this stage, the tragedy almost made sense. Panic. Disorientation. Cold. A terrible sequence of decisions, amplified by an unforgiving environment. It could have ended there. But the mountain was not finished. The remaining 4 hikers were not found until months later. Winter held them tightly, burying them beneath layers of snow that concealed everything. As spring approached, and the snow began to melt, searchers discovered a ravine. It was not immediately visible from above. Snow collected there deeply, silently, creating a natural trap. When the bodies were finally uncovered, the case changed forever. These deaths did not resemble the others. The injuries were severe. One hiker had a fractured skull. Another had multiple ribs crushed inward. The force required was immense. Medical examiners would later compare it to injuries seen in high-speed car accidents. And yet, there were no external wounds. No broken skin. No bruises consistent with such trauma. It was as though the damage had come from inside the body, not from impact against a visible object. This contradiction unsettled everyone who examined the case. Falls leave marks. Avalanches leave patterns. Violence leaves traces. Here, there were none that fit. One woman, Ludmila Dubinina, bore injuries that would come to define the public memory of the incident. Her tongue was missing. Her eyes were gone. Parts of her face were absent. Official explanations followed. Decomposition. Scavenging animals. Soft tissue is vulnerable, time and exposure can be cruel. But even among professionals, these explanations felt incomplete. Then came another detail, one that did not belong. Radiation. Traces were found on some clothing items. Not enough to cause death. Not enough to be immediately dangerous. But enough to be noticed. Enough to be recorded. Enough to disturb. The source was never clearly identified. During that era, the Soviet Union conducted secret military tests, often in remote regions. Witnesses from distant settlements later reported seeing strange glowing lights in the sky, orange orbs drifting silently across the horizon, around the same time. Whether these events were connected remains unknown. The investigation did not linger on these questions. Instead, it closed. The official conclusion stated that the hikers died due to a compelling natural force. No further explanation followed. The case files were sealed. The area was restricted. Families were discouraged from asking questions. In that time and place, silence was often enforced. But silence does not erase uncertainty. For the families, grief was complicated by confusion. They were asked to accept explanations that did not explain. To bury their children without understanding how or why they died. One man could not let go. Yuri Yudin, the hiker who had turned back early, lived with the knowledge that a single decision separated his fate from theirs. He attended funerals. He studied photographs. He read reports again and again. For decades, he returned to the evidence, hoping to find something that would make sense of it all. Until the end of his life, he believed the group encountered something sudden and external. Something they could not see clearly. Something that gave them no time to understand, before forcing them into motion. As years passed, the Dyatlov Pass Incident refused to fade. It became more than a tragedy. It became a question. Books were written. Documentaries produced. Theories multiplied. Avalanche. Rare wind phenomena. Psychological panic. Secret military activity. Each explanation answered one part of the mystery, while leaving others untouched. The calm footprints still waited for explanation. The crushed bones still resisted simple causes. The missing tongue still unsettled. And the mountain remained silent. As details of the incident spread beyond the mountains, something subtle began to shift. What had first been understood as a tragic accident slowly transformed into something more difficult to name. Not because new evidence kept appearing, but because the evidence that already existed refused to align. The more carefully people looked, the less certain they became. Every answer introduced another question. Every explanation seemed to leave something behind. What unsettled investigators most was not the injuries themselves, but the behavior that came before them. 9 individuals, all trained, all experienced, all capable of surviving extreme cold, had reacted in a way that contradicted everything they had learned. They did not argue. They did not hesitate. They did not scatter immediately. They acted together, as if a single decision passed through the group, without words. That kind of collective response is rare. Human fear usually fractures groups. One person panics. Another resists. Voices rise. Confusion spreads. But here, the evidence suggested unity. A moment when all 9 reached the same conclusion, at once. Whatever they perceived, whatever they felt, it did not allow time for debate. It demanded action. Some psychologists believe the key to understanding that moment lies not in what the hikers saw, but in what they felt. Under certain environmental conditions, The human body can react before the conscious mind understands what is happening. The northern Ural Mountains are known for complex wind behavior. When strong winds move across uneven terrain, they can create low-frequency sound waves, known as infrasound. These vibrations are not heard. They are felt. People exposed to infrasound often describe the same sensation. A sudden certainty that something is wrong. Not logically wrong. Viscerally wrong. A fear without a visible source. An overwhelming urge to escape. The body reacts before the mind can reason. If something like this occurred that night, it might explain the urgency. The slashes in the tent. The flight into the darkness. A shared physiological response, triggered by the mountain itself. But even this explanation has limits. It does not explain why the hikers continued downhill instead of immediately returning once outside. It does not explain why some later attempted to go back, while others moved deeper into danger. And it does not explain the severe injuries in the ravine. Fear alone cannot crush ribs. It cannot fracture skulls without leaving marks. This is where the story begins to fracture. Some researchers believe the ravine holds an important clue. After reaching the forest, the group appears to have separated, not chaotically, but purposefully. 2 stayed near the cedar tree, attempting to maintain a fire. 3 tried to return to the tent. 4 moved deeper into the terrain, possibly searching for better shelter. This suggests something critical. That whatever fear drove them from the tent was no longer present. They were thinking again. Planning. Adapting. Which raises a disturbing possibility. That the moment of greatest danger may have already passed. And that what followed was something else entirely. The ravine itself was steep, uneven, with snow accumulating deeply over time. Some believe the 4 hikers fell into it while moving in the dark. Others believe they descended deliberately, hoping the depression would block the wind. Snow buried them slowly, silently. But falls leave evidence. They leave patterns. They leave marks. The injuries here did not fit neatly. Others suggest a localized snow collapse. Not a full avalanche, but a sudden shift of compacted snow, pressing down with enormous force. This could explain internal injuries, without external wounds. Pressure distributed across the body, rather than focused impact. A crushing force that arrived suddenly, and vanished just as quickly. It is a compelling idea. But it still leaves questions. Why only some hikers? Why no matching damage to clothing? Why no similar injuries near the tent? Every attempt to solve one part of the mystery isolates another. Then there are the lights. Several witnesses in distant settlements reported seeing strange glowing orbs in the sky, orange spheres, drifting silently across the horizon on the night of the incident. At the time, the Soviet military conducted missile tests and experimental launches, often without public acknowledgement. Some believe the hikers witnessed something unexpected. A test. An explosion. A shock wave. Enough to frighten them. Enough to cause injury. Enough to leave traces of radiation. But again, there is no proof. Only coincidence. And coincidence is a fragile foundation for certainty. The official investigation avoided these contradictions. Instead of resolving them, it closed the case with language broad enough to contain anything. A compelling natural force. The phrase offered no clarity. It satisfied paperwork while leaving families and researchers with nothing solid to hold. Over time, the Dyatlov Pass Incident became less about solving a case and more about confronting the limits of explanation. It challenged the belief that every event, given enough data, can be neatly understood. It forced people to consider the possibility that some truths remain incomplete, not because information is missing, but because human frameworks are insufficient. For Yuri Yudin, the mystery never softened. He revisited the site. He studied reports. He imagined the night again and again, trying to locate the moment when everything changed. Until his death, he believed the hikers encountered something unknown. Not supernatural, but unmeasured. Unaccounted for. Outside the models people rely on to feel safe. As decades passed, the mountain remained unchanged. Snow fell. Wind moved. Trees stood still. The tent site faded back into the landscape. But the story did not fade. It lived on, in questions, in debates, in quiet fascination. Standing on that slope today, it is difficult to imagine panic. The land looks ordinary. Silent. Almost peaceful. And yet, something about the place feels restrained. As though it remembers something humans do not. When the Soviet Union collapsed decades later, many believed the truth about the Dyatlov Pass Incident would finally surface. That sealed archives would open. That hidden reports would emerge. That answers would arrive at last. But when documents were reviewed and testimonies re-examined, nothing appeared that resolved the mystery. There was no confession waiting in a file. No classified explanation hidden behind red stamps. Only the same fragments, rearranged, reread, still refusing to form a complete picture. In 2020, Russian authorities officially reopened the case. This time, they brought modern tools, computer simulations, terrain modeling, snowpack analysis. The conclusion felt familiar. An avalanche. More specifically, a delayed slab avalanche. According to this explanation, a compacted layer of snow above the tent shifted hours after the hikers settled in, pressing suddenly against the tent wall. Enough to frighten them. Enough to injure some of them. Enough to convince them that staying inside was more dangerous than leaving. On paper, the theory was elegant. In reality, it changed very little. Experts quickly raised concerns. The slope angle was still considered too shallow. The tent had not been buried or destroyed. The footprints leading away from the site were preserved too clearly. And while a snow slab could explain pressure injuries, it could not easily explain why the group moved downhill instead of sideways, or why some later tried to return, while others moved deeper into danger. Once again, an explanation answered one question and left the others untouched. And so the Dyatlov Pass Incident returned to its familiar place. Not solved. Not closed. Simply reclassified. For those who have lived with this story for years, this outcome felt inevitable. The incident has always resisted finality. It does not want to be resolved cleanly. It lingers instead, in the space between knowing and not knowing, where human curiosity tends to live longest. What makes the case endure is not just the unanswered questions, but the way it challenges deeply held beliefs. We like to believe that experience protects us, that preparation creates safety, that knowledge grants control. The hikers at Dyatlov Pass embodied those beliefs. They were skilled. They were cautious. They were organized. And yet, none of that prevented what happened. That contradiction is deeply unsettling. It suggests there are moments when preparation is not enough. Moments when forces align. in ways we do not fully understand. Moments when human judgment, no matter how well trained, is overwhelmed. Perhaps the hikers were not wrong. Perhaps leaving the tent was the correct decision. That possibility is uncomfortable, because it implies that the danger they perceived was real, even if we cannot identify it now. That the cold, which eventually killed them, may not have been the most immediate threat at that moment. That survival sometimes requires choosing between risks, without knowing which one is worse. Standing on that slope today, it is easy to forget how quickly conditions can change. The mountain looks gentle, the horizon wide, the silence complete. But silence can be deceptive. It hides movement. It hides pressure. It hides subtle signals that experienced hikers learn to feel rather than hear. The wind still behaves strangely there. Snow still gathers in unexpected ways. Sound still moves differently. Those who visit the site often describe a strange awareness. Not fear, not dread, just a sense that the place does not explain itself easily, as though it exists on its own terms, indifferent to human interpretation. The memorial nearby is simple. Names, dates, faces and photographs. Young faces, confident faces. They do not look like people walking toward disaster. They look like people in motion. People in the middle of a story that was supposed to continue. Yuri Yudin once said that the hardest part was not surviving when his friends did not. It was living without knowing why. He spent decades carrying that question, turning it over, examining it from every angle. In the end, he accepted that some answers might never come. That acceptance did not bring peace, but it brought honesty. The Dyatlov Pass Incident endures because it does not offer comfort. It does not reassure. It does not resolve into a lesson or a warning. It simply exists, asking us to sit with uncertainty. It reminds us that not every mystery has a solution that satisfies. That some stories remain unfinished, not because we failed to investigate them, but because reality itself does not always resolve cleanly. Perhaps one day, new evidence will surface. Perhaps a detail will emerge that finally connects the pieces. Or perhaps the truth has always been visible, scattered across the snow, misunderstood, because it refuses to conform to expectation. Until then, the mountain remains. Snow falls. Wind moves. Footprints vanish. And the story waits. Not for answers, but for listeners. For those willing to sit quietly with the idea that sometimes, even when everything is done right, the outcome is still unknowable. 9 people entered the northern Ural Mountains, believing they would return together. They did not. And whatever happened to them on that winter night did not leave behind a clear explanation, a warning, or a lesson. Only silence. Only absence. Only questions that still whisper softly across the snow.